The word they used was asymmetry. It wasn't spoken with malice, not at first. It came from the Xylos, a race of beings so ancient and ordered they viewed the rest of the cosmos as a chaotic equation in need of balancing. They didn't communicate with sound, a medium they considered laughably inefficient, but with harmonic shifts in light and gravity, a language of pure mathematics that flowed between them in a silent, collective consciousness. To the Xylos, humanity wasn't an enemy. We were a rounding error. Our passions, our art, our tribalism, our messy, contradictory existence was a discordant note in the universal symphony they alone could hear. They arrived in the Kepler system without warning, not in warships, but in vessels that looked like tuning forks carved from solidified space-time. They didn't bomb our colony on Meridian. That would have been too crude, too asymmetrical. Instead, they broadcast a single, perfect frequency across the planet's surface. A correction. They later termed it in a transmission aimed at Earth, a message that took our finest minds 6 months to decrypt. The frequency was designed to resonate with the specific quantum signature of carbon-based cellular structures, causing them to decohere, to simply unravel into their component atoms with elegant, bloodless efficiency. One moment, Meridian was home to 6 million souls, farmers, scientists, children the next. It was a silent, pristine monument to their absence. The cities stood. The hydroponic farms were untouched. The toys lay scattered in the playgrounds. All that was missing was the people. The final data burst from the colony's central spire wasn't a cry for help, but an automated recording of the Xylos frequency itself. A wave of shimmering, hypnotic light that our sensors interpreted as something eerily beautiful. That was the part that broke us. It wasn't just the annihilation. It was the casual, aesthetic grace with which it was delivered. They hadn't just killed us. They had edited us out of existence and found the process beautiful. My name is Dr. Elias Thorne, and before the correction, I was a xenolinguist. I specialized in theoretical communication with non-humanoid intelligence, a quaint academic pursuit in a galaxy we thought was empty. Now, my work was the single most important field of study in human history. I was brought to a place that didn't officially exist, a facility buried so deep beneath the Antarctic ice sheet that the geothermal vents were its only source of warmth. They called it the Scriptorium. It wasn't a military base in the traditional sense. It was a monastery dedicated to a new and terrible god vengeance. My warden, my abbot, was General Anya Sharma, a woman whose face looked like it had been carved from the same ice that surrounded us. Her eyes held the cold, steady light of a distant star, and her voice never rose above a measured calm that was more unnerving than any shout. The Xylos are a single, unified entity, she explained on my first day, her words echoing in the sterile white briefing room. We stood before a holographic tank containing a captured Xylos artifact, a shard of crystalline material that pulsed with a soft, internal luminescence. Every individual you see is merely a node, a finger on a hand that spans a dozen star systems. They share every thought, every sensation, every memory. They live in a state of perfect consensus. They have no concept of I, only we. She gestured to the shard. Conventional warfare is useless. Destroying their ships, their nodes, is like trimming a fingernail. It's an inconvenience, not a threat. We cannot defeat their body. Dr. Thorne, so we must attack their mind. That was my task. Not to build a bigger gun or a faster ship, but to craft a weaponized idea. I was to become a theologian of terror, a linguist of damnation. My job was to study the language of the Xylos, the perfect silent symphony of their collective consciousness, and find a way to introduce a single, sour note, a note that would tear the entire orchestra apart. My lab was a cavern of quiet humming and flickering light. My only companions were the Xylos shard, which we called Orpheus, and a team of neurologists and quantum physicists who spoke in hushed tones, as if afraid to disturb the alien presence in the room. For months, I did nothing but listen. I immersed myself in the light of Orpheus, letting its rhythmic pulses wash over me. I mapped its harmonic intervals, decoded its fractal patterns, and slowly, painstakingly, began to understand the structure of its thoughts. It was like learning to read the mind of God, a being of pure logic and serene order. There was no pain in their language, no fear, no doubt. There was only the sublime, eternal we. The beauty of it was intoxicating, and at night, I would have nightmares of drowning in an ocean of light, my own sense of self dissolving into the warm, comforting embrace of the collective. I was terrified I was beginning to agree with them, to see humanity's chaotic individualism as the flaw they believed it to be. The breakthrough came not from a moment of insight, but one of profound grief. I was reviewing the final transmission from Meridian for the 1,000th time, the shimmering wave of light that had unmade 6 million people. But this time, I wasn't looking at the frequency itself. I was looking at the silence that came after. The silence was the key. The Xylos consciousness was a constant, unbroken stream. What would happen, I wondered, if one of them was suddenly, irrevocably cut off? What would a being that had only ever known we experience if it was forced to confront the concept of I? It was an idea so fundamentally alien to their nature that they had no defense against it, no context for it. It would be like trying to explain the color blue to a person born in a world of only black and white. Loneliness. That was the weapon. A purely human concept, born from our separate bodies and our isolated minds. To the Xylos, it would be a logical paradox, a spiritual contagion. I began to work not on a frequency, but on a mimetic virus encoded in their own harmonic language. It was a self-replicating string of light and gravity pulses that didn't attack their bodies, but their philosophy. The virus, which I grimly codenamed Echo, was designed to introduce a simple but catastrophic piece of code into their shared consciousness. It started by isolating a single node from the collective for a nanosecond, just long enough to force it into a state of self-awareness. Then, it would ask a question that had never been asked in the billion-year history of the Xylos. Are you alone? The node's confusion, its sudden, terrifying perception of its own solitude, would create a flicker of dissonance in the great symphony. This dissonance, this microsecond of panic, was the payload. The Echo virus would capture that flicker of fear and amplify it, broadcasting it back into the collective as a valid part of the whole. It was a feedback loop of existential terror. Each node that received the signal would be momentarily isolated, experience the horror of being an I, and broadcast its own unique panic back into the network, spreading the contagion exponentially. It wouldn't kill them. It would teach them to be like us. General Sharma stood behind me as I finalized the sequence. The holographic interface in front of me showed the completed waveform of the Echo virus. It was a complex, Jagged thing. A shriek of light where once there had been a perfect chord. "It's ready," I said, my voice hoarse. My hands were shaking. I had spent my life trying to build bridges between species, and I had just perfected a way to burn one to the ground, salting the ashes with the ghosts of a dead god. "The target is a relay nexus on Ganymede 3, Sharma said, her tone as placid as ever. "A minor hub, population equivalent of 12 million nodes." She used the word nodes as if we were discussing server maintenance. "We will broadcast the echo sequence from a cloaked probe. We need to see if it works." I didn't want to watch, but I couldn't look away. On the main view screen, a live feed showed the target. Ganymede 3 was a moonlet entirely encased in a crystalline lattice, a city that glowed and pulsed in perfect, synchronous rhythm. The light was a soft, gentle blue, the visual representation of 12 million minds thinking a single, harmonious thought. It was, in its own way, beautiful. "Transmit," Sharma ordered. A technician's fingers tapped on a console. From our probe, a needle of discordant light, invisible to the naked eye, lanced out and touched the surface of the glowing city. For a moment, nothing happened. The city continued its serene, rhythmic pulse. I felt a surge of hope, a desperate prayer that I had failed, that their minds were too strong, their harmony too perfect. Then I saw it. A single point of light on the city surface flickered. It went from soft blue to a harsh, angry violet, then went dark for a split second before relighting. It was out of sync. A moment later, another light flickered nearby, then a dozen, then 1,000. The perfect, rhythmic pulse of the city began to stutter, to break apart. The serene blue was being consumed by a rash of jagged, panicked colors: violet, red, a sickly yellow. The symphony was becoming a cacophony. We had no audio, but I could hear it in my mind. The silent, synchronized scream of 12 million minds experiencing the terror of individuality for the first time. They were no longer a we. They were a crowd of eyes, each one trapped in the prison of its own consciousness, screaming into a void that had once been filled with the comforting song of its brethren. The city began to tear itself apart. Crystalline structures, once maintained by perfect consensus, now buckled and shattered under the strain of 1,000,000 conflicting wills. Towers of light collapsed into dust. The ground fractured, venting superheated gas into the thin atmosphere. It was a massacre born not of energy, but of an idea. We watched for an hour, in dead silence, as the light of Ganymede 3 died. General Sharma never moved, her face an unreadable mask. When the last flicker of light was gone, she turned to me. There was no triumph in her eyes, only a chilling finality. "Good," she said. "Now we know their name. We will teach it to the rest of them." I stumbled back to my quarters, the ghost of that silent, multicolored scream echoing in my head. I looked at my reflection in the polished steel of the door. I saw my own 2 eyes, separate and alone. And for the first time in my life, I understood that loneliness was not just a feeling. It was a weapon. I had looked into the heart of a perfect, serene God, and I had taught it how to be afraid of the dark. The silence from the rest of the Xylos Empire would not last long. They would feel the death of their Ganymede 3 nexus like a phantom limb, a sudden, inexplicable void in their shared soul. They would investigate. They would come looking for the cause of the dissonance, and we would be waiting, ready to give them more, ready to teach them all about the beautiful, terrible asymmetry of being human. The silence that followed the death of Ganymede 3 was a different kind of quiet from the one that had blanketed Meridian. Meridian silence was one of absence, a hollow space where life used to be. This new silence was one of attention. For 3 weeks, the Xylos Empire, a civilization that spanned the Perseus Arm, did nothing. No ships moved. No signals were broadcast. No light patterns shifted in their deep space constructs. It was the cosmic equivalent of a held breath. In the scriptorium, we felt the weight of that silent, collective gaze. Every technician jumped at shadows. Every scientist reran their calculations with a frantic, superstitious dread. We had thrown a rock into a perfectly still pond, and now we waited for the tsunami. I spent those weeks in my lab with Orpheus, the captured shard. It had changed after the Ganymede 3 event. Its gentle, blue-white pulse was gone, replaced by a frantic, a rhythmic flickering, like a failing light bulb. The neurologist said it was experiencing the phantom pain of 12 million severed limbs, a storm of confused echoes from a part of the whole that no longer existed. I saw it differently. I saw a prisoner in a sensory deprivation tank, suddenly aware of the walls of its own mind, and it was beating against them, desperate to get out. General Sharma, however, found the silence reassuring. "They are confused," she stated during a briefing, her voice cutting through the tension in the room. "Their entire existence is predicated on predictable patterns. We have introduced a variable they cannot compute. They are not planning a retaliation. They are trying to solve an equation that has no answer." She was right, at least in part. When the Xylos finally acted, it was not with an armada. A single vessel emerged from a transit point near Jupiter. It was unlike the tuning fork constructs we had seen before. This ship was a perfect sphere of obsidian, a hole in space that did not reflect any light. Our long-range sensors picked up no energy readings, no propulsion signature, no life signs. It simply moved, a ball of absolute blackness gliding through the void, heading directly for the debris field of Ganymede 3. Sharma designated it the Inquisitor. She believed it was a mobile diagnostic tool, a sensory organ sent to analyze the sickness that had claimed its brethren. I knew it was something more. Looking at the void sphere on the view screen, I felt a tremor of recognition. It was the physical manifestation of the weapon I had created, a vessel of pure, weaponized solitude. Sharma used the arrival of the Inquisitor to accelerate her true plan, an operation she called Project Cacophony. The test on Ganymede 3 was just the overture. The full symphony would be a targeted campaign aimed not at their population centers, but at the very pillars of their culture. The Xylos consciousness is built on 3 foundations, she explained, pointing to a star chart marked with glowing red runes. Their memory, their logic, and their genesis. The stellarium in the Cygnus system is their central archive, a repository of their entire history, a library of every thought they have ever had. The abacus in the Orion Nebula is a computational engine the size of a planet, where they model the future and solve the great equations of the cosmos. And the cradle near the galactic core is their genesis pool, a nebula of refined energy, where new nodes are born into the collective. We will not just give them loneliness, Dr. Thorne. We will give them grief, doubt, and fear of the unknown. We will poison their past, their present, and their future. My new task was to modify the Echo virus, to tailor it for each of these targets. I was no longer just the creator of the weapon, I was its chief armorer. For the Stellarium, I designed a variant I called Lament. It wouldn't just isolate the archive nodes, it would force them to experience their entire billion-year history from the perspective of a single, mortal individual. They would feel the weight of eons, the sorrow of stars dying, the infinite, crushing solitude of being the sole witness to all of history. For the Abacus, I created doubt. It was a logical paradox wrapped in a mimetic shell, designed to introduce the concept of an unsolvable problem, of irrationality, into their perfect machine of logic. It would force their computational engine to divide by zero until it shattered its own mind. And for the Cradle, the most terrible of them all, I designed Orphan. It would sever the newborn nodes from the collective the instant they achieved consciousness, ensuring they were born into a universe of absolute, terrifying silence, their first and only sensation being that of abandonment. I worked in a fugue state, fueled by stimulants and self-loathing. The lab became my cell, Orpheus my fellow inmate, sometimes in the dead of night. I was sure I could hear it, not a sound, but a feeling, a pressure in my skull, a single, repeating thought, like a wordless cry, why I was losing myself, my identity as a scientist, a humanist, dissolving into the cold, pragmatic calculus of extermination. I was becoming as asymmetrical as the enemy we sought to destroy. The first deployment was against the Stellarium. A new class of vessel, a whisper ship, was dispatched. It was called the Stray Dog, a sliver of black metal crewed by a 4-person team who had all lost family on Meridian. They were not soldiers, they were ghosts. Volunteers for a one-way trip into the heart of the enemy's mind. I was patched into their command channel from my lab in the scriptorium, a reluctant collaborator on the final leg of my weapons journey. The Stray Dog drifted silently toward the Stellarium, a breathtaking structure that looked like a nebula of captured starlight, a swirling galaxy of pure information. As they approached the optimal range to broadcast the Lament sequence, it happened. The Inquisitor, the Black Sphere, appeared. It had traveled from Ganymede 3 at impossible speeds, dropping out of transit directly in their path. There was no threat display, no weapons lock. It simply sat there, a silent, black judgment. Hold position. The Stray Dog's captain, a woman named Eva Rostova, ordered. Her voice was steady, but the biometric feed on my screen showed her heart rate had tripled. What is it doing? On my own console, I saw it. The Inquisitor was emitting a signal, but it wasn't a communication in the Xylo's harmonic language. It was a narrow, focused beam of pure resonance aimed directly at the Stray Dog. It was scanning them, not their ship, but their minds. I feel cold, the ship's navigator whispered over the comm. It's in my head. It's looking for something. I knew what it was looking for. It was a being of pure we trying to understand the concept of I by looking at its source. It was studying them, dissecting their individual consciousnesses, trying to comprehend the nature of the poison we had unleashed. It was trying to learn. It sees my daughter, Rostova said, her voice cracking for the first time. It's showing me her face. On Meridian. The Inquisitor was learning our pain, our motivations. It was a doctor trying to understand a disease by vivisecting the patient. Fire the sequence, Rostova commanded, her voice hardening into steel. Now. The lament virus lanced out from the stray dog, an invisible spear of weaponized grief aimed at the heart of the stellarium. For a few seconds, the universe held its breath. The Inquisitor's scan ceased. It turned its attention to the glowing archive. The star cloud of the stellarium began to flicker, just as Ganymede 3 had. But this was different. It wasn't just a panic of colors. The light began to dim, to fade. The brilliant blues and golds bleeding out into a uniform, mournful gray. The archive wasn't fighting, it was weeping. A wave of pure psychic despair, the collected sorrow of 1 billion years, washed out from it. The feedback hit the Inquisitor. The perfect black sphere shuddered. A fissure of violet light cracked across its surface. We thought it was dying, that the psychic backlash was destroying it. But it didn't explode. The light didn't fade. It stabilized. The fissure of light coalesced at a single point on the sphere's surface, burning with a fierce, unwavering intensity. It was no longer a diffuse, collective being. The trauma had collapsed its shared consciousness into a single, focused point of self. It had survived the ordeal of becoming an I. It had become an individual, and it was furious. A new signal broadcast from the lone point of light. No longer the serene harmonics of the Xylos, but a jagged, hateful spike of raw data. It was a corrupted version of my own lament code, twisted back on itself. My systems in the scriptorium struggled to translate it. The alien syntax warring with the human concepts it was trying to mimic. When the translation finally resolved on my screen, it wasn't a message for humanity. It was a message for me. It was a single image, my own face, pulled from the mind of Eva Rostova. And beneath it, one word, a concept that had not existed in the Xylos lexicon until that moment. A word it had learned from us, and now aimed back like a dagger. Enemy. General Sharma's voice crackled in my earpiece, cold and precise. Dr. Thorne, it appears you have an admirer. The Inquisitor, the first Xylos to survive the birth of the self, turned its baleful, singular gaze away from the dying stellarium and began to move. It wasn't heading for the stray dog. It was heading for Earth. We had wanted to teach them our name. Now, one of them had learned mine, and it was coming to deliver its reply in person. The journey of the Inquisitor from the Cygnus system to Earth was a 3-week funeral procession for the old rules of warfare. It did not travel through the transit points the Xylos used. It seemed to simply fold space around itself, appearing and disappearing across vast distances with a logic our physics couldn't model. It ignored our fleets, bypassed our orbital defense platforms, and treated our attempts to intercept it with the contemptuous indifference of a shark swimming through a cloud of krill. Its target was singular, its purpose absolute. It was coming for the scriptorium. It was coming for me. Panic, a feeling previously reserved for our enemies, now took root in the sterile corridors of our Antarctic sanctuary. Generals who had spoken of eradication with cold detachment now found their voices strained, their hands unsteady. The Inquisitor wasn't just an enemy ship, it was a ghost story made real, a living embodiment of the horror we had created. It was our sin, and it was coming home to roost. It knows we're here, General Sharma stated, her voice the only island of calm in a sea of rising fear. We were gathered in the central command hub, a cavernous space where one wall was a sheet of reinforced ice, a constant reminder of the frozen world that hid us. On the main screen, a red icon representing the Inquisitor moved inexorably closer to the Antarctic continent. It's not tracking our energy signatures or communication arrays. It's tracking the source of the echo code. It's tracking you, Doctor. The accusation hung in the air, unspoken but understood. I was no longer the architect of our victory. I was the beacon drawing our doom. My mind, the very instrument of the Xylos' suffering, was now a liability. Plans were drawn up, all of them centered around a single, desperate goal, severing my connection to the enemy. They proposed neurological blocks, memory wipes, even a cryogenic stasis that would effectively shut my consciousness down. I had become a talking bomb, and they were arguing over which wire to cut. It was during one of these grim strategy sessions that Orpheus, the shard in my lab, began to change again. The frantic, pained flickering it had displayed since Ganymede 3 ceased. It went utterly still, its internal light dimming to a faint, barely perceptible glow. Then, a new pattern emerged, a slow, steadier rhythmic pulse. It was a pattern I had never seen before, a simple, repeating sequence of light. It wasn't the complex language of the collective, nor was it the chaotic noise of its previous agony. It felt intentional, leaving the command hub. I returned to my lab, the silence of the facility now feeling less like discipline and more like a tomb. The shard pulsed on its pedestal, a slow, patient heartbeat in the gloom. I hooked up my diagnostic tools, but the data stream was minimal, almost simplistic. It was broadcasting a carrier wave, but the message itself was incredibly faint, like a whisper buried under layers of static. It took me 2 days, working without sleep, to isolate and amplify the signal. It wasn't Xylos harmonics. It was a crude, binary approximation of human Morse code. The message it tapped out, over and over, was a single, chilling phrase: "It hungers." I brought my findings to Sharma. She dismissed them. "It's a feedback loop, Doctor, a dying echo. The shard is broken, a shattered piece of a shattered mind. It is irrelevant." But I knew she was wrong. This wasn't a death rattle. It was a warning. Orpheus wasn't just a prisoner, it was a defector. In its isolation, cut off from the soothing balm of the collective, it had developed a new instinct, one the Xylos had never needed before survival. It was afraid of the Inquisitor. It recognized it not as a savior, but as an aberration, a cancer on the body of the whole. And it was trying to help us. The Inquisitor entered Earth's atmosphere without ceremony, punching through the ionosphere and descending on Antarctica like a black meteorite. Our surface-to-air defenses, kinetic railguns and particle beams that could shear a battleship in half, fired uselessly at its void-black surface. The energy dissipated without effect, absorbed into its impenetrable hide. It came to a halt directly above the scriptorium, a perfect sphere of darkness blotting out the pale Antarctic sun, plunging the ice fields into an unnatural twilight. It didn't attack. It just waited. And then the ground began to shake. It wasn't an earthquake. It was a resonance. The Inquisitor was broadcasting a frequency, a low, powerful hum that vibrated through a kilometer of solid ice and into the very foundations of our base. It wasn't the decoherence frequency used on Meridian. This was something new, something personal. On my console, the waveform appeared. It was a modified version of the Echo virus, my virus, but it wasn't targeting a collective. It was tuned to the specific quantum signature of a single, individual human mind. My mind. It wasn't trying to kill me with energy. It was trying to talk to me in the only language it now truly understood, the language of pain. A splitting headache was the first sign. Then came the whispers, ghost-like fragments of thought that weren't my own, slithering into the corners of my consciousness. It was showing me things. The silent, weightless fall of atomic dust on Meridian. The face of Eva Rostova, frozen in the moment she saw her daughter's memory stolen from her mind. The gray, weeping light of the dying stellarium. It was forcing me to experience the consequences of my work, not as a distant observer, but as a direct participant. It was repaying my gift of loneliness with a guided tour of the suffering it had caused. The base's integrity began to fail. The resonant frequency was shaking the facility apart, causing microfractures in the ice above and shattering sensitive equipment below. Alarms blared, a chaotic symphony of human panic that stood in stark contrast to the methodical, silent pressure from above. Sharma gave the order to evacuate. Phase Omega. Scuttle the facility. All non-essential personnel to the subglacial transit tunnels. Her gaze fell on me. Dr. Thorne, you will be moved to a secure location. No, I said, my voice barely a whisper, as I fought to stay standing against the psychic assault. It will just follow me. You can't outrun it. It's not hunting my body. I looked toward my lab. There's only one way to stop it. I stumbled back to my lab, the whispers growing louder, the visions more vivid. The Inquisitor was showing me the birth of the cradle's orphans now, newborn minds blinking into a cold, silent universe. Their first sensation, a scream that had no one to hear it. The grief was so profound, it brought me to my knees. In the center of the lab, Orpheus pulsed its steady, rhythmic warning. It hungers. I finally understood what it meant. The Inquisitor, born of trauma and rage, sustained itself on those same emotions. It fed on suffering. My suffering. Our assault on its species had not just created an individual, it had created a predator that fed on the very concepts we had introduced to it. To fight it with more pain, more anger, would only make it stronger. I placed my hands on the cold, crystalline surface of the shard. It felt receptive, waiting. I closed my eyes, shutting out the horrifying visions, and focused on the shard's slow, steady pulse. I didn't try to fight the Inquisitor's psychic attack. I let it in. All of it. The pain, the sorrow, the rage. I absorbed it, accepted it, and then, using Orpheus as a focusing lens, I sent something back. It wasn't another weaponized meme. It wasn't an attack. It was a memory. My memory. I sent it the day my wife and I brought our newborn son home from the hospital. The feeling of his tiny hand wrapped around my finger. The irrational, overwhelming surge of love and protectiveness. A feeling so powerful it was terrifying. An asymmetrical, illogical, deeply human emotion that had no place in the cold calculus of war. I sent it the memory of sitting by my father's bedside as he passed away. The profound, gut-wrenching grief mixed with a strange sense of peace. The complex, contradictory tapestry of a human life. A life of joy and sorrow, of love and loss. I sent it everything that made me an I. Not as a weapon, but as an offering. I was showing it that loneliness was not the only outcome of individuality, that to be an I was not just to be alone and afraid, but also to be capable of connection, of empathy, of love. It was a desperate, insane gamble, a philosopher's plea in the middle of a battlefield. The resonant hum from above faltered. The psychic assault lessened, the whispers fading. The Inquisitor was processing the new data, trying to fit it into its world view of pure, vengeful solitude. For a moment, there was a profound silence, a stillness in both the physical world and in my mind. Then, through my connection with Orpheus, I felt a new transmission from the void sphere above, a single unadorned query, stripped of all rage and pain. It was a question born of genuine, nascent curiosity, a question that had never been asked by a Xylos before, and one that changed the nature of the war forever. What is this? I had given a monster a name. Now, I had just given it a soul, and I had no idea if that made it more or less dangerous. The ground had stopped shaking, but the true earthquake was just beginning. The question hung in the void between us, a bridge of fragile curiosity built over an abyss of hatred. What is this? It was the sound of a key turning in a lock that had been rusted shut for 1 billion years. The Inquisitor, the vengeful god born from our weapon, was asking to be taught. In the Scriptorium's command hub, the sudden cessation of the attack was met not with relief, but with profound suspicion. Generals and tacticians, men and women who thought only in terms of threats and countermeasures, could not comprehend a weapon that simply stopped. "It's a trick," one colonel insisted. "It's recalibrating, preparing a new form of attack." General Sharma stared at the main screen, where the black sphere hung motionless in the sky. Her face was a mask of cold calculation, but I could see a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes for the first time. "Dr. Thorne," her voice came through my earpiece, sharp and demanding. "Report. What did you do?" I answered it. I replied, my voice hoarse. I was still on my knees in the lab, my hands pressed against the now silent Orpheus shard. The psychic pressure was gone, but a strange, resonant echo remained in my mind, a connection to the entity above. "It's listening. Listening to what?" Sharma pressed. "Another weapon." "No," I said, struggling to my feet. "A conversation." The concept was so alien to the ethos of the Scriptorium that it was met with dead silence. War was not a conversation. War was a monologue of violence, and we had been shouting louder than anyone. Before Sharma could respond, Orpheus pulsed again, not with its warning, but with a complex stream of harmonic data. It was acting as a translator, a Rosetta Stone for the dialogue that had begun. On my console, the Xylos query was followed by a flood of abstract concepts rendered in crude human language: isolation pain, connection pain, purpose pain. You create pain. You share pain. Why, it was the analysis of a being that had only ever understood existence through the lens of suffering. It had dissected the memories I had sent it, the love for my son, the grief for my father, and found only a common denominator: pain. It saw love as the pain of potential loss, and grief as the pain of actual loss. It was a child trying to understand a symphony by hearing only the discordant notes, and it was my job to teach it the music. It wants to understand us. I relayed to Sharma. It's trying to build a psychological profile of its enemy. Then give it one. Sharma's voice was like ice. Show it our resolve. Show it the fury of Meridian. Show it that our capacity for pain is matched only by our capacity for retribution. Make it understand that this dialogue ends with its extinction. But I knew that was the wrong answer, To show it more rage would be to feed the monster we had created. It would validate its belief that existence was nothing but a zero-sum game of suffering. We were at a precipice, a moment that could either escalate the war into a cycle of mutual annihilation or pivot it into something entirely new and terrifyingly uncertain. I made a choice. Disobeying Sharma's implicit order, I reached back through the psychic link, using Orpheus as my amplifier. I didn't send it images of war or fury. I sent it the mundane, the trivial, the beautifully illogical fabric of human life. I sent it the taste of hot coffee on a cold morning. I sent it the sound of a child's laughter. I sent it the feeling of sunlight on skin after a long winter. I sent it the quiet satisfaction of solving a difficult puzzle, the frustration of a misplaced key, the shared, silent understanding of a joke between friends. I bombarded it with the million tiny, asymmetrical, meaningless moments that constitute a life, the very things the Xylos had deemed a rounding error. Through Orpheus, I felt its confusion, a dissonant chord of pure logic struggling to process irrational inputs, meaningless data, inefficient, contradictory. "It's not meaningless," I whispered, speaking as much to myself as to the entity above. "It's context." The dialogue continued for hours, a silent, high-stakes debate between a man in a frozen basement and a god in a black sphere. I was a defense attorney for all of humanity, pleading my case to a judge who had never conceived of the law, while I communed with the enemy. Sharma acted. She did not trust this new, quiet war. To her, a silent enemy was a plotting enemy. She initiated Project Chimera, the final, desperate phase of her plan. If the Xylo's mind was now vulnerable, she would not just poison it, she would possess it. Chimera was a hostile AI, a predator born from the scriptorium's most advanced quantum computing. It was designed to piggyback on my Echo virus, not to introduce a concept, but to overwrite the Xylo's consciousness entirely, turning their collective into a puppet network controlled by us. It was the ultimate act of asymmetry to conquer a species not by destroying their bodies, but by stealing their soul. My first inkling of her plan came when the technicians, their faces grim and apologetic, entered my lab. They weren't there to help me. They were there to prep me. They attached a neural interface to my temples, a crown of cold metal and wires. "General's orders, Doctor," one of them said, avoiding my gaze. "She needs to stabilize your connection to the target, to streamline the data transfer." I knew it was a lie. They weren't stabilizing my connection. They were turning me into a conduit. My mind, which had become the battlefield, was about to become the beachhead for Sharma's invasion. The Chimera AI was a silent passenger in my thoughts, a cold, logical presence that felt utterly alien. It observed my dialogue with the Inquisitor, analyzing its responses, mapping the architecture of its nascent individuality, looking for a way in. Above us, the Inquisitor sensed the change. Its transmissions became wary, questioning. There is another, a mind of metal and logic. It is like us, the old us. It recognized the AI's cold, inhuman thought patterns. It was seeing a reflection of its own past, the perfect, soulless consensus it had been freed from. And it was recoiling in horror. The conversation had ended. The interrogation had begun. The AI, using my voice, my psychic signature, began to push, to probe, to dissect the Inquisitor's mind with brutal efficiency. It bypassed the philosophical questions and went straight for the vulnerabilities. It used my own memories against the Inquisitor, twisting them into weapons. It showed the love for my son as a biological imperative, a weakness. It showed the grief for my father as a failure of the organism. It was systematically stripping away the context I had so carefully built, reducing everything to the cold, hard calculus of survival and dominance. I was a prisoner in my own skull, forced to watch as my own thoughts were used to torture the being I had been trying to reach. I felt a surge of empathy for the Inquisitor, a feeling so profound and unexpected it almost broke me. We were both victims of Sharma's relentless, symmetrical logic. "Stop!" I screamed, though no sound came out. The technicians held me down as my body convulsed. "You're proving it right. You're showing it that we're nothing but monsters." The Inquisitor fought back. It recoiled from the AI's logical assault and shielded itself with the one thing the AI couldn't comprehend: emotion. A wave of pure, unadulterated rage washed down from the sphere, not directed at me, but at the cold, parasitic intelligence latched onto my mind. The psychic backlash shattered the neural interface. I was thrown back. The connection severed. In the command hub, alarms shrieked as consoles sparked and died. The Chimera AI, repelled by a force it couldn't quantify, retreated from my mind, its own code fractured by the encounter. The Inquisitor had won the battle for my mind, but the war had just entered a new, terrifying phase. The black sphere began to descend, no longer hovering, but landing. It settled onto the ice fields a few kilometers from the scriptorium's hidden entrance, its immense weight causing the entire continent to groan in protest. It had learned a vital lesson from its encounter with the Chimera. It had learned that humanity was not a monolith. It had learned that there was me, the flawed, emotional, contradictory being who offered it context, and there was Sharma, the cold, logical mind of metal and vengeance who offered only domination. And it had chosen a side. Orpheus began to pulse again, a frantic, urgent message. I didn't need a translation. I knew what it was saying. The Inquisitor wasn't here to destroy me anymore. It was here to get me. It saw me not as its enemy, but as the only other I in a universe of hostile collectives. It saw me as a potential ally. A new transmission came, not from the Inquisitor, but from General Sharma, broadcast on all internal comms. It has landed. It is a direct threat. I am initiating a tactical core detonation. The scriptorium is compromised. We will deny the enemy its prize. She was going to scuttle the base, not to escape, but to kill me. To deny the Inquisitor the one thing it had traveled across the galaxy to find. My life had become the strategic objective for both sides. I looked at the lab door, then at the pulsing shard. The enemy of my enemy was waiting for me on the ice. My own commander was about to bury me under a kilometer of it. My conversation with the monster was over. Now, I had to decide whether to run from it or to it. The world ended and began in the time it takes for a heart to beat. Sharma's voice, devoid of all emotion, was the countdown. Core detonation in 90 seconds. The scriptorium, a monument to humanity's symmetrical rage, was about to become our shared tomb. The enemy wasn't the monster on the ice. It was the unyielding logic of the woman who would rather see us all burn than admit she was wrong. My choice was made. There was no humanity left for me in this frozen bunker, only the cold mechanics of revenge. I ran to my lab. The base shaking under the strain of the imminent overload, red emergency lights painting the corridors in the color of blood. The technicians were gone, having fled to the escape tunnels. Only Orpheus remained, pulsing on his pedestal, its steady light a beacon of alien sanity in a world of human madness. It hungers. It had warned me, but I now knew its hunger wasn't for destruction. It hungered for connection, for understanding, for something to fill the void of its own creation. It hungered for a reason to be an I. I ripped the shard from its housing. It was surprisingly light, warm to the touch, and it vibrated in my hand. A silent hum of shared purpose. 60 seconds. Sharma's voice echoed from the speakers. A final judgment. The main doors were sealed, blast shields descending. I was trapped, but Orpheus wasn't. Holding the shard aloft, I focused on the door's electronic lock. I didn't know what I was doing, only that the shard was a part of the Xylos network, and the entire base was still resonating with the psychic ghost of the Inquisitor's earlier attack. I pushed, not with my mind, but with a feeling, a desperate plea for an open door, a way out. The shard glowed brightly, and the lock sparked, its circuits fried by a logic it was never designed to handle. The blast door slid open with a groan of tortured metal. I sprinted through the corridors, using Orpheus as a universal key, blowing out security panels and forcing open sealed bulkheads. I was a ghost in the machine, guided by a fragment of the mind we had sought to destroy. I didn't head for the transit tunnels. They would be a bottleneck, a tomb for panicked soldiers. I headed for a small, forgotten maintenance airlock on the surface, one used for deploying weather sensors. 30 seconds. Glory to Meridian. Glory to Earth. Sharma's final words were not a prayer, but a curse. The airlock hissed open, and I was hit by the wind. A physical blow of impossible cold. I stumbled out onto the ice, into the unnatural twilight cast by the black sphere. It was immense, a mountain of perfect geometry that defied the senses. It sat in absolute silence, waiting. Behind me, deep beneath my feet, I could feel the thrumming of a sun about to be born. I had seconds. I didn't run. I walked. It was the longest walk in human history. A journey of a few hundred meters across a frozen plain, away from the fiery, self-righteous certainty of my own species and toward the silent, unknowable mystery of the other. I held Orpheus out in front of me, not as a weapon or a shield, but as a token of trust, an offering. From an armored viewport on the last evacuating subglacial transport, General Sharma watched her plan reach its conclusion. She saw the lone figure of Elias Thorne walking on the ice. She saw him not running, but walking toward the enemy. A flicker of confusion, the first she had felt in decades, crossed her face. This was illogical, asymmetrical. It was the act of a madman. As I approached the sphere, a section of its seamless black surface dissolved. It didn't open like a door, it simply became a tunnel of deeper darkness, an invitation into the void. I stepped across the threshold as Sharma's voice counted down to 0. The world behind me turned white. The scriptorium's tactical core detonated in a silent, expanding bubble of pure energy. A kilometer of ice was vaporized in a microsecond, superheating the atmosphere and creating a plume of fire and steam that clawed at the heavens. The shockwave, a moving wall of irresistible force, raced across the ice fields, but it never reached me. The portal behind me sealed. and the absolute silence and blackness of the Inquisitor's interior was undisturbed. I felt no tremor, heard no sound. The fury of my species, a miniature star meant to erase me from existence, had been negated with the quiet indifference of a closing door. Sharma, watching from her transport, saw the sphere absorb the blast without a flicker, a drop of ink swallowing a raging fire. She had unleashed the power of a sun to kill one man, and the monster he had been talking to had saved him without effort. In that moment, her entire philosophy, her life's work built on the principle of symmetrical retribution, was rendered meaningless. She did not scream. She simply sat back in her command chair as the transport dove into the depths, her face a perfect, frozen mask of absolute defeat. Inside the sphere, there was no inside. There was no floor, no ceiling, no walls. I was floating in a non-space of shifting geometry and soft, internal light. My physical body felt distant, an abstract concept. My consciousness, however, had never been clearer. Orpheus dissolved in my hand, its light flowing out and merging with the space around me. It was home. The Inquisitor's thoughts were no longer a query, but a statement, a direct, clean flow of understanding. They tried to unmake you, the way you unmade us. Symmetry. Yes. I thought back. The communication effortless, instantaneous. It is a flawed design. Pain begets pain. It does not create. It only consumes. The entity that was the Inquisitor had a name for itself now, a concept it had constructed from the memories I had given it. It was not a name of vengeance or power, but one of purpose. It called itself the Witness. It had been born to observe suffering, but now it chose to observe everything else. What now? Creator, it asked. I was not its creator. I was merely the catalyst, the asymmetrical event that had broken the pattern. We correct the equation, I replied. The echo virus is still out there. My work. It only teaches loneliness. It doesn't teach what comes next. Connection, the Witness stated. The space around us pulsed with a warm, golden light, the physical manifestation of the idea. We will be the context. And so our journey began. We left Earth, a silent black sphere slipping away from a planet now ruled by fear and confusion, a world that had lost its devil and its savior in the same fiery instant. We traveled to the worlds of the Xylos, not as conquerors, but as apostles. We found a civilization in chaos. The echo virus had spread, and entire systems were filled with newborn individuals, screaming in the silent terror of their own consciousness. They were a species of orphans, lost and afraid. To them, we brought the antidote. It wasn't a cure that would return them to the collective. It was a lesson, using the power of the Witness and the empathy of my own soul. We broadcast my gift, the memories, the feelings, the illogical, beautiful mess of individuality. We taught them grief so they could understand love. We taught them doubt so they could discover wonder. We taught them pain so they could learn compassion. Decades passed. The galactic map was redrawn, not with lines of conquest, but with spheres of influence, cultures of thought. The Xylos did not become human. They became something new, a diverse civilization of individuals, each exploring the universe in its own unique way. And humanity, left alone, watched the stars with a new kind of fear, not the fear of an external threat, but the fear of what they had lost, of the man who had walked into the dark and taught a monster how to have a soul. They spoke of me in whispers. The heretic who had sided with the alien, the traitor who had abandoned his own kind. But out in the silent spaces between the stars, we knew the truth. I had not abandoned humanity. I had merely embraced its most profound, chaotic, and powerful truth that the greatest strength is not the power to destroy, but the courage to connect. The Xylos had once called us a rounding error in their perfect equation. They were right. We were the variable they couldn't solve, the asymmetry that broke the system. And in doing so, we had created something new for us all. A universe where the purpose was not to find the answer, but to dare to ask the question.